In Washington, there are buildings people photograph the way they photograph flags, because they've been taught that the image itself is proof of virtue. The U.S. Capitol is one of those buildings, a dome that pretends it was inevitable, a symbol that asks you to forget the hands that lifted it into place. But between the 1790s and the 1820s, long before tourists lined up for guided tours and schoolchildren memorized dates, the Capitol was not a symbol. It was a work site, a churn of mud, stone, timber, heat, and human exhaustion. And the federal government solved its labor problem the way powerful institutions always have when they can get away with it. It rented human beings, not hired, not employed. Rented. There are receipts for this. Not the kind of receipts that preserve dignity, nothing that reads like a life, nothing that resembles a biography, the kind that turns a person into a line item, wage rolls and vouchers that list Negro hire, and promissory notes that treat a man's strength like a monthly expense paid to someone else. And if you've never seen those words, if you've never heard them spoken aloud in the same sentence as U.S. Capitol, that's not an accident. It's the result of a choice. Choices stacked on choices for generations, until the silence feels like history. Because here is the dirty secret about national myths. They don't survive by being true. They survive by being protected. In the early years, when the district was still more swamp than city, the commissioners responsible for building this seat of American law faced a problem. There weren't enough willing hands. Skilled labor was expensive. The work was brutal. The deadlines were political. And the solution, quietly proposed, quietly implemented, was to pull enslaved people from nearby plantations and force them into federal service. The money went to the enslavers. The work went into the Capitol. And the names, when they appeared at all, were often reduced to first names or categories, or a label that did the work of erasure all by itself. You can learn everything about a society by what it records meticulously, and what it records as disposable. The official story of the Capitol is a story of architects and statesmen, of design competitions and cornerstone ceremonies, of ambition made stone. It is a story told in marble and triumph. But there is another story, one that lives in the margins of the archive, in ledgers that were never meant to be inspirational, in slips of paper written by clerks who assumed nobody would ever care about the people they were describing. And when evidence surfaces that threatens the official story, a pattern repeats. A discovery, a pause, a decision made quickly, quietly, and framed as practical. Then the work continues. The narrative remains intact. The people disappear again. That is the mechanism we're going to expose. Because you cannot build a republic on coerced labor and then pretend the coercion was incidental. You cannot erect the nation's most visible monument to law while quietly purchasing, leasing, and consuming lives outside the law's protection. You cannot claim the building stands for liberty while the paperwork beneath it says something else. So tonight, we're not going to admire the Capitol. We're going to read it. We're going to follow the paper trail that runs under the speeches and behind the plaques. We're going to trace how enslaved labor became federal infrastructure and how the people who did that labor were pushed out of the record on purpose until unknown started to feel normal. And before we go any further, I want to set a standard, because this isn't entertainment dressed up as history. This is history that was treated like something you weren't mature enough to handle. If you're listening from Washington, D.C., Maryland, Virginia, anywhere in the United States, tell us where you're listening from. Not because it's a gimmick, because these stories happened in real places, and the distance people feel from them is part of how the erasure works. If we can locate ourselves, we can't pretend we didn't know. Now, let's begin. In Washington, there are stones that speak, not in speeches, not in plaques, not in the curated sentences tourists are meant to repeat on the ride home. These stones speak in the only language institutions cannot fully control, what they were forced to hold, what they were built to conceal, and what time cannot polish into innocence. The public story is clean. The U.S. Capitol rises from a swampy federal city like a promise made in marble, representative government, checks and balances, the dignified architecture of a new republic. You've heard the names attached to that promise. You've heard the dates that flatter it. You've been taught to look up at the dome and feel something like inevitability. But the Capitol did not rise from inevitability. It rose from procurement, from desperation, from ledgers, from contracts, from bodies leased like tools, and from a bureaucratic habit that is older than this country and more durable than stone. If a truth threatens the symbol, bury it, first in paperwork, then in silence. Between the 1790s and the 1820s, the Capitol was built, burned, rebuilt, expanded, and completed. It was also staffed, supplied, and physically raised by enslaved laborers, men whose work appears in surviving payment records and wage rolls, and whose lives were treated as incidental to the project's success. The institution could not have afforded to build the symbol any other way. The institution also could not afford to admit what that means. Tonight, we are not exploring. We are not wondering. We are reading the receipts. We begin where these stories always begin, at a work site, under orders, where someone finds something they weren't supposed to find. It is a small moment, the kind that rarely makes its way into official history. A crew working in the Capitol complex, not in the chambers where cameras linger, but down where architecture becomes infrastructure, where stone meets soil, where old work touches new work, where the past is inconveniently physical. A shovel strikes something that is not stone, not clay, not debris. The sound is wrong, hollow, brittle, final. The worker pauses, scrapes again, exposes a curved surface, and realizes his mistake. This is not material. This is remains. A foreman appears, then a supervisor, then someone who speaks in the calm voice of authority. The excavation stops. Tools are set down. A perimeter is formed. And the first instruction is not reverence, it is containment. No photographs, no speculation, no calls outside the chain. The official note will read like weather: obstruction encountered, a delay, a technicality, a scheduling issue. Nothing that suggests what was actually in the ground, nothing that invites the wrong kind of question. If you're waiting for the dramatic confession, you won't get one. That is not how modern institutions handle old bodies. They handle them the way they handle everything else that threatens a symbol, with process, with language that turns horror into an administrative inconvenience, with decisions that feel reasonable in isolation and monstrous in aggregate, because the most effective cover-up is not a man in a dark coat. It is a memo that never mentions what you saw. And that is the real story of how the U.S. Capitol was built. Not just that enslaved people labored there, though they did, and the records prove it, but that the system that needed them also needed them to remain unnamed, uncounted, and unremembered. The official story gives you architecture. The paper trail gives you economics. And economics, especially in the early republic, was a polite word for who got to be human. In 1790, Congress passed the Residence Act, and the federal government committed itself to a new capital city along the Potomac. A federal district was carved out, and a city was planned, on land already worked by enslaved people, surrounded by a slave economy, designed to be the seat of liberty while feeding on bondage. In 1791, the planning began in earnest. The terrain was not the heroic landscape of paintings. It was humidity and mosquito water and mud. It was distance, sparse housing, scarce skilled labor, and an unfinished city expected to become the beating administrative heart of a nation. There was a deadline with teeth. Congress was expected to meet in the new capital by 1800. That meant buildings, not just any buildings, symbol buildings. A president's house, a capitol, a visible claim that the republic was real and permanent. But symbolism costs money. Money was what the new government did not have. The 1790s were not a decade of abundance. They were a decade of debt, political fragility, and constant fear that the experiment would collapse under its own contradictions. So the commissioners and planners did what administrations always do when the schedule is holy and the budget is thin. They outsourced the suffering. They did not frame it that way. They framed it as necessity, as common practice, as an arrangement with local owners. Hire the labor that already exists. Pay the person who claims ownership. Feed the worker just enough to keep the worker working. And, most important, keep the records clean. Clean records do not mean truthful records. Clean records mean legible records, records that protect the project, records that satisfy the accountants and leave historians with the impression that everything unpleasant was incidental. This is where the story becomes document dark. Not because the documents are secret, many survive in public archives, but because the darkness is embedded in their form. The darkness is how the paperwork speaks about people. The paperwork does not ask, "Who is he?" It asks, "How much per month?" It does not ask, "Will he return?" It asks, "Was the owner paid?" It does not ask, "What happened to the missing man?" It asks, "Who can replace him?" If you want to understand how a nation builds a symbol on coerced labor, you do not start with speeches. You start with vouchers. The records, wage rolls, promissory notes, receipts, show a pattern. Payments made for the hire of enslaved people. Sometimes the worker is listed by a first name, sometimes only by category. The money is reliably recorded. The person is not. This is not accidental. This is what it looks like when a government participates in an economy of ownership while claiming it represents the owned. The Capitol's early construction begins in the 1790s. A design is selected in 1793. The project moves forward in fits and starts. Anxious, expensive, politically visible. The building is not just a structure, it is a deadline made physical. And under that deadline, the workforce is assembled the way a workforce is assembled when freedom is not required, by leasing human beings from nearby enslavers in Maryland and Virginia. These laborers did the work that makes monumental architecture possible before it becomes monumental, clearing land, cutting timber, hauling stone, digging foundations, firing bricks, lifting heavy loads with ropes and raw strength. The glamour of democracy is always built on unglamorous labor. Here, that labor was coerced. You can feel the institution's discomfort in the way it writes. It seldom says enslaved plainly. It prefers soft language. Servants, hands, laborers, hire. When it does reveal its truth, it does so in the cold shorthand of property. One surviving style of record labels the labor as Negro hire. 2 words, no surname, no lineage, no testimony, just race and rental status, identity reduced to the terms that made exploitation administratively easy. This is the first kind of burial, linguistic burial, a human being put under a label, and a label put above a ledger line, and a ledger line put above a nation's self-image. The second kind of burial is temporal. The Capitol was not finished in one clean arc. It was built, interrupted, repaired, built again. The timeline itself becomes a cover, because a long project creates gaps, and gaps are where responsibility goes to disappear. By 1800, Congress is meeting in Washington. The city is still raw, but the symbol must be usable. In the public mind, that moment becomes the birth of a functioning capital. But in the paper trail, it is also the moment the machinery of coerced labor is normalized, treated as routine, treated as background. And then, in 1814, the Capitol burns. British forces set fire to the building during the War of 1812. Flames move through spaces that were never meant to be seen as fragile. Documents are lost. Work is disrupted. The structure becomes a ruin, and ruin does what ruin always does. It invites reconstruction narratives. It invites rebirth. It invites a story where the past can be conveniently rewritten as before and after. Fire is an accomplice, not because it is intelligent, but because it is thorough. It consumes evidence. It creates plausible deniability. It turns questions into ash. Rebuilding begins. In 1818, a new architect is brought in to complete the work. By 1826, the Capitol is declared complete. Think about that. From the 1790s to 1826, more than 3 decades in which the building that would become the legislature's cathedral was constructed by a labor system that denied people's humanity. More than 3 decades in which the nation refined its language about liberty while depending on unfree labor to make the language look respectable. And in those decades, the records do what records are designed to do. They protect the project. They do not preserve the names. They preserve the payments. When the Capitol is discussed in sanitized histories, the emphasis lands on visionary design and political progress, on architects and legislators, on the long arc of the Republic. But the long arc is not a moral force. It does not bend by itself. People bend it. And for much of early American history, people bent it with enslaved hands. Let's be precise. The reason this story can be told is that some documentation exists. Wage rolls survive. Vouchers survive. Ledgers survive. Enough survives to prove that enslaved African Americans were hired out and paid for as property during the building of the Capitol. But what survives is also proof of what was designed not to survive. Because the records preserve the owner more reliably than the worker. Owners have full names, addresses, reputations, standing. Workers become first names, categories, or numbers. The institution's relationship is with the person it pays, not the person who suffers. This matters because memory follows documentation. The system that chooses what to document chooses what a nation can later claim it didn't know. This is the moral hinge. The government did know. Not in the abstract sense. This wasn't a rumor. It wasn't a secret. It was an invoiced practice. So when later generations act surprised, when they treat the enslaved labor behind federal landmarks as a scandalous revelation, they are not discovering new history. They are confronting old history that was never allowed to become part of the proud story. The proud story is written in stone. The shame story is written in paper, and paper is easier to misfile, easier to burn, easier to lose, easier to summarize away with a euphemism. If you are listening and thinking, but surely a building as famous as the Capitol must have commemorated the people who built it, hear the trap in that word, surely. Surely is what the institution depends on. Surely someone would have said something. Surely it would be in the textbooks. Surely the record would be complete. But the record was never meant to be complete. It was meant to be useful. In the 1790s, useful meant finishing the building on time. In the 1800s, useful meant restoring national confidence. In the 1810s and 1820s, useful meant rebuilding and expanding, proving permanence after the humiliation of fire. At no point did useful require listing the names of enslaved workers in a way that would demand moral accounting. And that is why, when you read the paperwork, you encounter a familiar horror. Presence without recognition. Work without credit. Payment without personhood. The Capitol, like so many American symbols, is a monument not just to ideals, but to an operational truth. The state can praise liberty and still rent bondage, as long as it controls the language and keeps the suffering beneath the line item. In the next layer of the paper trail, you begin to see the mechanics that made that possible. It begins with geography. The federal city sits between slave-holding states. It is surrounded by plantations and ports and markets where enslaved labor is not an exception, it is infrastructure. That proximity makes human leasing easy. It makes cruelty convenient. It continues with labor scarcity. Skilled craftsmen are difficult to recruit to an unfinished city. Wages rise. Complaints follow. Free workers can leave. Free workers can refuse. Free workers can speak. Enslaved workers cannot. So the institution makes a rational choice that is also a violent choice. It taps a workforce that cannot bargain and cannot publicly testify. It places them under overseers, assigns them the dirtiest and most dangerous work, and records them in a way that prevents the future from hearing their names clearly. Here is a rule you can rely on across American history. What cannot testify will be exploited. What can't be named will be denied. And what can be denied can be repeated. This is why the dark document tone fits. Not because we are embellishing the truth, because the truth is already dark and the documents are already complicit. The documents are not neutral witnesses. They are part of the system that produced the suffering, and they reveal something else. Not just that enslaved people worked at the Capitol, but that the government understood exactly how to make that labor appear ordinary. Ordinary. Routine. A line item. A cost. Once you accept that, you start to see the entire building differently. Not as a clean symbol built by clean hands, but as a structure that required invisible labor, and then required that invisibility to persist. Because if the labor becomes visible, the symbolism changes. The temple becomes a ledger, the marble becomes an invoice, the rhetoric becomes a confession. And institutions rarely confess unless forced. So the question is not whether enslaved labor built the Capitol. The records already answer that. The question is what else those records imply. What conditions were normal, what injuries went unrecorded, what deaths became paperwork problems instead of human tragedies, and how many names were reduced to a category because the nation could not afford to remember them. If you want the most honest version of early American history, do not ask what the Republic said it believed. Ask what it paid for. Ask who was paid. Ask who was not. And then ask the question the ledger tries to prevent. What happens to a human being when a government's highest symbol is built on the assumption that some people do not need to be fully recorded? In the next section of this story, we follow the money more closely, into the hiring arrangements, the labeled lists, and the bureaucratic language that turned bondage into a procurement strategy. Because once you see the mechanism clearly, you can no longer treat the omission as an accident. You have to call it what it was. Policy. Follow the mechanism, and you will find the truth the monument was designed to outlive. In the early federal city, labor was not merely scarce. Labor was politically volatile. Free workers demanded wages. Free workers negotiated. Free workers quit. Free workers talked. That last part mattered more than anyone admits. A free workforce leaves behind complaints, letters, newspaper items, petitions. Things that force the public to see the cost of a project in human terms. A leased enslaved workforce leaves behind something else: receipts. By 1791, the planners and commissioners responsible for the new capital were already leasing enslaved labor to clear land and move materials. The logic was consistent and brutal. The government needed workers who could be compelled, and the surrounding region had a ready market of human beings held as property. The arrangement did not require a public announcement; it required a payment. The record-keeping reflects that purpose. The paperwork is structured to preserve the relationship that mattered to the state, the relationship between the federal project and the enslaver who could deliver bodies on demand. It preserves full names and formalities for the people who could litigate, lobby, or embarrass the project. It preserves only fragments for the people who actually built it. This is what erasure looks like when it is done with ink instead of fire. A typical hiring arrangement is not written like a confession. It is written like commerce: a promissory note, a voucher, a line authorizing payment for the hire of an enslaved person, often measured in months. The government does not pay the worker; the government pays the owner. That single decision, who receives the money, controls everything that follows: who is considered a party to the agreement, who is documented, who is replaceable, and who can be disappeared without bureaucratic consequences. When people argue that the early republic could not afford its buildings otherwise, they are telling you something true without naming what it means. The government built the capital by converting bondage into a budgeting strategy. It did not simply inherit slavery from the era. It used slavery as an instrument of public construction. And once slavery is an instrument, the record-keeping becomes a weapon. Look at the labels. When an institution writes Negro hire, it is not merely describing race. It is defining a category designed to separate certain workers from the protections of ordinary labor. A category meant to minimize attention, minimize obligation, and minimize historical trace. This is why the names blur. This is why the surnames vanish. This is why one month shows a first name and the next month shows only man or boy. It is not a clerical accident. It is the language of a system that does not require individuality in order to extract labor. Now bring that language to the ground. In the 1790s, the capital's early work was not the elegant work visitors imagine. Before any chamber could host debate, the site had to be made buildable. Trees cleared, earth moved, foundations dug, lumber cut and hauled, stone transported and shaped, bricks produced in large quantities. The labor was heavy, repetitive, and hazardous, and it consumed bodies the way large projects always consume bodies, through strain, injury, and disease. The federal city was swampy, humid, and poorly drained. Summer bred fevers. Water quality was inconsistent. Medical care, where it existed, prioritized those whose lives were recognized as socially valuable. If a free artisan broke a leg, there were consequences that could reach a supervisor's desk. If a leased enslaved laborer collapsed, the paperwork could treat it as a supply issue: return him, replace him, continue. That is the second kind of burial: procedural burial. A human crisis converted into an operational adjustment. The capital also required skill. This matters because one of the most persistent sanitizations is the insinuation that enslaved people only did unskilled tasks, while the real building was done by trained craftsmen. The record does not support that comforting split. Enslaved laborers were present across the pipeline, quarrying, carpentry support, hauling, brickmaking, and other tasks that demanded experience, endurance, and competence. In a construction environment like the 1790s federal city, unskilled often meant not formally credited, not incapable. Credit is not a neutral category. Credit is a political decision. If you want to see that decision, look at what gets recorded when white craftsmen appear in the same set of accounts. For free workers, the records tend to be more complete: names, roles, rates, sometimes origins. For enslaved workers, the record is satisfied with less. The logic is explicit. The government's legal relationship is with the enslaver, not with the worker. The worker is not a contracting party. The worker is not expected to have a future worth documenting. Once you understand this, you can predict the shape of the archive without even opening it. You will find an abundance of paper proving the government paid. You will find far less paper proving the worker lived. That brings us to the part institutions prefer to keep abstract: conditions. Every large building site in that era was dangerous. But danger does not distribute evenly. It follows power. It follows whose pain matters. It follows who can refuse. On a site built partly by leased enslaved labor, the risk profile changes. Safety becomes optional for the people who cannot leave. Food becomes a cost to be minimized. Housing becomes temporary by design because the worker's comfort has no value to the project beyond keeping the worker upright. A quarter for leased laborers in the 1790s is not the kind of housing the Republic celebrates in its founding mythology. It is whatever can be thrown up quickly near the work. Rough wooden structures, minimal bedding, minimal heat in winter, minimal ventilation in summer. Provisions are cheaper staples. If someone gets sick, the easiest solution is not treatment, it is removal. Removal is not mercy. Removal is evidence management. If an enslaved laborer is returned to an enslaver because he is injured or ill, the government's paperwork can remain clean. The line item ends. The replacement begins. The project moves forward. And if the returned worker dies days later, the death is no longer a federal problem. It is a private tragedy inside a private system, exactly where the government wants it. This is how institutional innocence is manufactured, not by preventing harm, but by relocating harm out of sight. Now the timeline tightens. By 1800, Congress is meeting in Washington. The Capitol is not complete in the way later generations imagined completion, but it is functional enough to serve the political requirement. The Republic has a seat, the symbol stands, and symbols create pressure. Once the building is in use, construction is no longer just construction, it is construction under scrutiny. In a functioning Capitol, every delay is political, every cost overrun is ammunition, every visible scandal is a threat. That is when record-keeping becomes even more careful, not necessarily more accurate, more careful. If a project is controversial, you do not write the controversial parts in language a future reader can weaponize. You bury them in euphemism, you scatter them across accounts, you let them dissolve into miscellaneous. And then, in 1814, the Capitol burns. Publicly, the burning becomes a story of national violation and resilience. The British attack, the fire, the humiliation, the resolve to rebuild. It is a story designed to unify. But in the archive, the fire introduces a different effect: rupture. Records lost, records moved, records separated from the context that would make them legible. Work crews changed, supervisors rotated. The building's physical fabric was disturbed, foundations were opened, walls were stripped, materials were reused. In the chaos of reconstruction, almost anything could be done and later framed as necessary repairs. This is why destruction is useful to institutions, not because it erases everything, but because it creates enough disorder that selective memory can be defended as accident. After the fire, rebuilding begins. The nation wants the symbol restored quickly. Reconstruction becomes a test of permanence. Can the Republic replace what was burned? Can it prove itself unshaken? That kind of narrative requires sacrifice. It always does. And when a nation demands sacrifice, it rarely begins by sacrificing its own comfort. It sacrifices those already designated as expendable. So the labor system continues. By 1818, the project is under new architectural direction, and the building moves toward completion. By 1826, the Capitol is declared finished. The completion story emphasizes architecture and national maturity, another chapter in the myth that the Republic grows cleaner with age. But the archive does not get cleaner, it gets quieter. Because the longer the project runs, the easier it is to let human loss blur into time. If a laborer disappears in 1795, who will ask in 1820? If a leased worker is replaced in 1799, who will connect the substitution to a body in the ground? Time is not just a passage. Time is a cover. This is the third kind of burial, historical burial. The slow, compounding effect of people deciding that what they know is not their responsibility to record. And yet, despite all of that, something survives. Not enough to recover every name. Not enough to reassemble every life. But enough to destroy the comforting lie that the Capitol rose solely from free hands. In 2012, a commemorative marker was placed acknowledging that enslaved African Americans helped build the Capitol and other federal buildings. That marker matters. It is an admission the institution resisted making for more than 2 centuries. It also exposes the scale of what the institution still cannot fully account for. Because the marker exists in a world where the archive is incomplete by design, where the most crucial human details were never prioritized, where the paperwork was constructed to pay owners, not preserve identities. So the question becomes sharper. If a government can acknowledge in 2012 that the Capitol was built in part by enslaved people, then the government also has to acknowledge what follows from that fact, that the Capitol's foundation is not only stone and mortar, it is a ledger of coerced labor. It is a structure financed by a system that made human beings rentable. And it is a national symbol whose cleanliness depends on what the record did not bother to keep. We are told to look at the building and feel pride. But pride that depends on forgetting is not pride. It is complicity with a choice someone else made for you. The early republic made that choice in the 1790s, and it refined it through the 1800s and the 1810s. It built a political temple while treating the builders as expendable and, when convenient, unnameable. This is not a mystery in the sense of, did it happen? It happened. The mystery is narrower and more damning. How much suffering did the paperwork successfully relocate out of the federal story? How many injuries became returns? How many returns became deaths in private silence? How many names were filed under a category because the nation needed the building to stand taller than the truth? If you feel the temptation to say, that was a long time ago, understand what that sentence really tries to do. It tries to let the symbol off the hook by pushing responsibility into the past. But the past is not asking to be absolved. The past is asking to be named. And if a building that calls itself the House of the People was built by people the records refuse to treat as people, then we do not honor the building by keeping the refusal intact. We honor the truth by breaking the pattern, by reading what survives, by describing what the language tried to hide, and by refusing to let an invoice stand in for a life. Now, we go deeper into the part the archive resists, the points where a labor system produces not just work, but casualties, injuries, disappearances, and the kind of silence that does not occur naturally, the kind that has to be maintained. There is a reason official narratives speak in architecture and not in attrition. A building site is a machine that converts time, material, and bodies into structure. If the bodies are free, the machine must negotiate. If the bodies are enslaved, the machine does not negotiate, it consumes. And the only question the paperwork needs to answer is whether consumption interrupts the schedule. In the surviving capital era accounts from the 1790s, the clearest human facts are financial. A name appears most reliably when the person is paid or when the person receives payment. Enslaved laborers, by design, are not paid. So their most reliable trace is the line that pays someone else for them. This is why the archive feels haunted even when it is quiet. It is full of activity, full of transactions, full of movement, yet thin on human continuity. You can watch the project breathe through invoices. You can watch it bleed through substitutions, and substitution is where casualties hide. A worker's presence is established by repetition. A name, even a first name, appears across weeks or months. Then the name stops. In a healthy labor record, that kind of disappearance triggers an explanation. Resignation, termination, transfer, injury, death. In a record built around hired bondage, disappearance often triggers only one administrative action: replacement. Replacement has a peculiar power. It resolves the logistical problem while erasing the moral one. It keeps the labor supply steady, it keeps the ledger balanced, and it turns a person's collapse into a staffing adjustment. In the 1790s, Washington was a city under construction built on a wet geography that rewarded disease. Summer fevers were not an anomaly. They were an expected cost of doing business in a malarial basin before modern sanitation. On any work crew, illness would have been common. The difference here is not that illness existed. The difference is what the institution did with it. A free laborer who falls ill becomes an inconvenience and a liability. He can talk, he can complain, he can sue, he can publish a grievance. An enslaved laborer who falls ill becomes a rental problem. He can be returned, exchanged, and quietly removed from the federal story with minimal risk. And that is how you get the darkest kind of record. One that shows labor continuing smoothly while people do not. The Capitol project required heavy hauling, lifting, cutting, digging, and firing, work that punishes lungs, backs, hands, and joints. Injuries are not hypothetical, they are inherent. A slipped rope is enough to crush bone. A fall on stone is enough to break a spine. A misjudged load is enough to end a life. But when your workforce is treated as leased inventory, the record does not need to name the injured. It needs to maintain throughput. So the paperwork shifts when it has to. A first name becomes a category becomes a number. A payment continues without a clear human counterpart. The accounting remains legible, the life becomes noise. There is a temptation, especially in patriotic narratives, to treat this as a limitation of early record-keeping, as if the absence of detail is just the innocent clumsiness of the 18th century. That is a comfortable mistake, because the same records that blur enslaved workers into categories can be very precise when precision protects the institution. They can be detailed about materials, about quantities, about deadlines, about disputes, about the people who have standing. The government was capable of accuracy. It chose where accuracy was necessary. It did not choose it for the people it treated as expendable. If you want to understand how casualties can be present and yet nearly invisible, study the economics of hire. Hire turns a human being into a monthly unit. When the unit breaks, the response is not grief. It is replacement, and the only record that matters is whether the owner is still owed money. This creates a second layer of concealment, incentives. An enslaver who leases out workers wants payment and wants the worker returned. The federal project wants labor and wants the schedule intact. If a worker is injured but can be returned alive, the problem stays contained. If a worker dies on or near the federal site, the project inherits a risk it cannot control, not only a moral risk, but a reputational one. So the system develops a preference, quiet, informal, rarely stated outright, for removal before the story forms. When a man collapses from fever, send him out of sight. When a man is injured, send him back. When a man cannot be returned, stop paying. When an owner asks questions, answer in the least specific language possible. That is the operational pattern. It does not require a conspiracy meeting. It requires shared self-interest and a shared understanding that the symbol must not be stained. By 1800, the pressure becomes sharper. Congress is in town. The building is a political stage. In the public mind, the Capitol becomes synonymous with governance itself. That is precisely when the institution's tolerance for scandal collapses. In a functioning Capitol, construction failures are no longer local. They are national. They become ammunition in rivalries. They become newspaper copy. They become proof that the federal city was a mistake, and so the system becomes more disciplined about what it allows to be known. When a work site has a casualty, there are two competing impulses: the impulse to address the danger and the impulse to protect the project. In a labor regime built partly on bondage, the second impulse is often stronger. The danger is tolerated. The visibility is not. This is why the most chilling question is not, did people suffer? The answer is obvious. The chilling question is, how did the institution prevent suffering from becoming a story? The answer is, by controlling the archive. The archive is not merely what survives. The archive is what was considered worth writing down at the time. If the institution believed enslaved workers were background, it did not write them as a narrative. It wrote them as inputs, and inputs do not get memorialized when they fail. They get swapped. The disappearance of an enslaved worker from a ledger line is not proof of death, but it is proof of a system where death could be absorbed without requiring the public to witness it. Now take that logic into the event that reshapes the building's entire history. In August 1814, British forces set fire to the Capitol. The burning of public buildings becomes part of America's national trauma story. It is the moment that invites the rhetoric of resilience. The Capitol as a victim, the Republic as wounded, but unbroken. But the burning also does something else. It resets accountability. Fire is not just destruction. Fire is permission. Fire gives the institution a new story to tell, one that is emotionally useful and morally simplifying. It turns attention away from the conditions under which the building was made and toward the heroism of rebuilding it. It shifts the nation's gaze from who built the symbol to who restored it. It makes the past before the fire feel like ancient history, even though many of the men who worked on the building in the 1790s would have still been alive in 1814. Alive, and still enslaved, and still unrecorded in the way citizens are recorded. After the fire, Reconstruction begins. In 1815, the work resumes in a city still developing and still dependent on the same regional labor market. If the early republic had used slavery as a construction tool before, Reconstruction offered even more justification to do it again. Emergency accelerates the excuses institutions use. A nation that feels attacked does not tend to scrutinize the morality of its logistics. It asks whether the building can be restored. It asks whether the government can function. It asks whether the symbol can stand. And the system supplies labor the way it knows how. By 1818, under a new phase of direction, the rebuilding pushes toward completion. By 1826, the Capitol is declared finished. The triumph narrative hardens. The building endured fire, and the Republic endured with it. But endurance is not virtue if it is funded by human disposability. Here is what you must hold in your mind as the timeline stretches from the 1790s into the 1820s. Slavery did not end because the building was completed. The laborers did not become free because the dome became famous. The exploitation that built the symbol continued in the city and in the nation long after the stonework was declared done. So when the institution celebrates completion, it is not closing a chapter of suffering, it is closing the chapter of visibility. The project ends. The paperwork gets boxed. The nation moves on to other crises. That is when erasure finishes its work. Because a scandal requires continuity, it requires people to keep asking the same question until it is answered. Erasure interrupts continuity. It turns a missing person into a missing line into a missing folder into a lack of documentation, and lack of documentation becomes the excuse used by later generations to avoid moral accounting. This is why the most honest way to describe the archive is not that it is incomplete, but that it was shaped by priorities. A government that treats some humans as property will not build records that honor those humans as citizens. It will build records that protect the transaction. There is an argument you will hear, spoken as if it were maturity, that we should judge the past by the standards of its time. That is a way of lowering the past's moral temperature so the present can stay comfortable. But the paperwork itself proves that the past understood its own danger. If the practice were morally neutral, it would not have needed euphemism. If it were socially acceptable to the Republic's ideals, it would not have needed to blur names into categories. If it were merely ordinary labor, the people who did it would have been recorded the way other laborers were recorded. The use of coercion was not only known, its contradiction with the symbol was known. That is why the institution managed language. That is why it managed memory. That is why it made the builders easy to overlook. This is where the dark document quality becomes unavoidable, because the darkness is not a rumor, it is a structural feature of the records themselves. In the 1790s, the language of hire is a mask. In the early 1800s, functional use of the building becomes a shield. In 1814, fire becomes a reset. In the 1820s, completion becomes closure. Each step offers the institution a new way to keep attention on the monument and away from the people. And then, much later, something changes. Not because the institution grows a conscience spontaneously, but because the silence becomes harder to defend. In 2012, a marker is placed acknowledging enslaved labor in the construction of the Capitol and other federal buildings. It uses the language the institution avoided when the work was being done. It is, in its own way, a confession, but confessions have limits when the archive was designed not to hold what would shame the symbol. Acknowledgement is not the same as recovery. You can place a stone marker on a public path and still fail to restore the names. You can say, they helped build this, and still not be able or not be willing to say who they were, how many they were, what happened to they when they were injured, how they were housed, how they were fed, whether they were returned, whether they died, where they were buried, and what the federal project chose to record about that. The marker matters. It also exposes the scale of what the institution spent centuries refusing to preserve, and that is why the ethical demand does not stop at acknowledgement. It moves to responsibility. Responsibility means reading the receipts without letting them absolve the reader. Responsibility means refusing to accept that a line item is an adequate substitute for a life. Responsibility means admitting that the nation's symbols were built inside systems that treated human beings as consumable inputs. If you are looking for a single dramatic document that declares in plain language, "We hid the casualties," you will likely be disappointed. Institutions rarely produce such clarity. They do not need it. They can accomplish the same end with a series of smaller choices. A euphemism here, a missing note there, a replacement order, a payment stopped, a record boxed, a story simplified. That is how a public building becomes a moral crime scene without ever needing a villain to sign his name. But we are not finished with the pattern yet, because the most revealing moments are not the ones where the institution says nothing. The most revealing moments are the ones where the institution is forced to respond, where someone with leverage demands answers and the paper trail becomes unusually fast, unusually careful, unusually defensive. That is where you can see the boundary of what the institution was willing to admit and what it was determined to keep permanently unnamed. When a system is confident it can ignore you, it does not bother to explain itself. It simply proceeds. It speaks in silence, and it assumes no one important will object. The record changes only when someone with leverage forces it to change. That leverage did not belong to the people doing the work. It belonged to the people who claimed ownership of the workers, to contractors who could delay the schedule, to officials whose reputations could be damaged, to anyone who could turn an internal problem into a public embarrassment. The enslaved laborers were the central force of construction, and yet they were structurally excluded from the one thing that creates accountability, the ability to demand answers in writing and have those answers preserved. So when you look for the institutional voice admitting harm, you do not look for compassion. You look for conflict. You look for the moments when a routine transaction breaks down, when payment is disputed, when a term is contested, when a worker is not returned on time, when an owner claims loss, when a replacement is demanded too quickly, too often, and someone finally notices the pattern as a financial problem. Those are the points where the bureaucracy cannot remain completely vague. It still tries, but the pressure forces it to produce language. And when it produces language, you see what the institution truly considers real. It considers the obligation to the enslaver real. It considers the obligation to the worker optional. The government's records, vouchers, wage rolls, promissory notes, were not written to honor labor. They were written to settle accounts. They tell you who was paid, when, and for what. They rarely tell you whether the person who did the labor survived the job intact. That absence is not merely a gap. It is a design feature of a system that depended on being able to move bodies through a project without creating a lasting human ledger of consequences. But even a system designed for concealment leaves fingerprints. One of those fingerprints is speed. When a project replies quickly, when an approval is rushed, when a decision is made in days instead of weeks, it often means the institution is trying to stop a question from becoming a narrative. Another fingerprint is wording. When a record that normally speaks in numbers suddenly speaks in soft moral language, unfortunate, regrettable, incident, circumstances, that is rarely empathy. It is liability management. It is the institution acknowledging that something happened while refusing to allow the reader to understand what. And the third fingerprint is the most telling, categorization. When a worker is reduced to hire, the institution can treat harm as a service disruption. When an owner is identified with full name and standing, the institution treats harm as a contractual matter. This is not an interpretation. It is the structural reality of who is documented as a person and who is documented as a supply. The consequence is predictable. If an enslaved laborer is injured, the record does not ask what pain he endured. It asks whether he can continue producing. If he cannot, the record asks whether he should be removed, replaced, and whether payment should continue. If he dies, the record asks whether and when the owner's compensation ends. The institution's moral accounting is embedded in what it chooses to calculate. This is how you create a building that looks like democracy and an archive that functions like bondage. Now consider what happens when that archive is confronted by the single force it respects: cost. By the late 1790s, as the federal city presses toward 1800, labor becomes a sensitive expense. The capital is consuming money and time in a city that still feels unfinished. Free labor is expensive, scarce, and unstable. Enslaved labor is cheaper on paper because the cost is contained to a rental fee paid to an owner. But cheap labor is not safe labor, and unsafe labor produces what the schedule cannot tolerate: interruption. So the system adapts without changing its moral foundation. It does not reject coerced labor. It manages the visibility of its consequences. If a cluster of workers becomes ill in summer heat, the priority is not care, it is separation, not for healing but for containment, containment of contagion, containment of delay, containment of reputation. When you are building the country's central symbol, you cannot afford a story about bodies collapsing in the mud. So you ensure there is no story. You ensure there is no public witness. You ensure that, at most, there is only a line in a ledger that quietly stops. This is what the institution did with many kinds of suffering in the early republic. It pushed suffering into a place that did not generate official language, because official language is the only thing the nation later calls history. Now we reach 1800. Congress meets in Washington, the building is used, and the symbol begins to perform its purpose. The public sees debates and ceremonies. The public does not see the labor pipeline, the hauling, the injuries, the fever seasons, the crowded quarters, the replacements. The building becomes a stage, and backstage becomes unimportant by definition. That is the psychological shift that enables long-term erasure. Once the symbol is functioning, most people stop caring how it was made. Then 1814 arrives, and the building burns. This is the moment the institution chooses to become a victim, because victimhood is a powerful cleanser. When British troops set the Capitol on fire in August 1814, the story becomes national outrage and resilience. The attack is external. The harm is inflicted by an enemy. The nation is unified in its condemnation. And in that unified story, internal contradictions are easy to bury. A burned building does not invite questions about labor. It invites questions about restoration. It invites a narrative of reconstruction as patriotic duty. It invites urgency, and urgency is the most reliable solvent of ethics. When a government says, we must rebuild, it rarely pauses to ask, at whose expense? It asks only, how quickly can we do it? So reconstruction begins. In 1815, the project restarts in a city still shaped by the same regional economy that fed the original construction. In 1818, new leadership pushes the building toward completion. By 1826, the capital is declared complete. The Republic celebrates endurance, permanence, growth. But permanence is not innocence. Permanence is just what happens when a structure survives long enough for people to forget what it cost. This is where the paper trail becomes even more revealing, because the longer an institution survives, the more it learns how to narrate itself. After 1814, the Capitol is not just a building, it is a testament, a symbol that withstood fire and came back stronger. That myth is useful. It turns the public gaze upward and outward. It encourages reverence. And reverence is a kind of silence. Reverence trains people not to ask questions that sound like accusation. What happens if you ask those questions anyway? The institution does what it has always done. It narrows the scope. It offers acknowledgement without detail. It offers generalities without names. It offers a safe admission that does not create obligations. This is why modern commemoration, when it finally arrives, matters and still falls short. When the Capitol publicly acknowledges, centuries later, that enslaved African Americans helped build the building, it is correcting a lie of omission. But it is also quietly admitting something else, that the omission lasted so long because it was not just ignorance, it was protection. Protection of the symbol, protection of the founding narrative, protection of the people whose legacies could not survive a full accounting of what they financed, permitted, and benefited from. If you want to see the ethical shape of that protection, return to the years. The 1790s show the mechanism being normalized. 1800 shows the mechanism becoming invisible under use. 1814 provides a cleansing catastrophe. 1815 to 1826 shows the mechanism continuing under the cover of rebuilding the nation, and the result is a building that governs the country while standing on a foundation of records that refuse to fully recognize the people who made it possible. This is not an accusation thrown at the past as if the past were a separate universe. This is an accusation against a continuity, against the way institutions inherit and refine the same tools of silence across generations. Because the Capitol did not only consume labor, it consumed memory. It consumed memory by ensuring that the most vulnerable participants were the least documented. It consumed memory by structuring its paperwork so that payments could be verified and people could not. It consumed memory by allowing casualties, injury, illness, disappearance, to become administratively absorbable events rather than human events that demanded public recognition. And the moral point is simple, even if the archive is complex. A democracy that cannot tell the truth about how its symbols were built is not merely forgetful. It is choosing which lives deserve to be part of the public story. That choice is not ancient. It is ongoing. It is present every time a record uses a category instead of a name. It is present every time commemoration arrives centuries late and calls that delay history, as if history were weather. It is present every time the institution offers a marker while the names remain scattered, incomplete, and unrecovered, because the system that created the archive did not consider those names worth preserving. If the Capitol is the house of the people, then the people it relied upon must be treated as people in the record, not as hire, not as background, not as a footnote to someone else's payment. That is the responsibility of the living, to refuse the convenient version, to refuse the polished myth, to read what survives, and to say plainly what the paperwork tried to soften. A symbol cannot be purified by ignoring its origin. It can only be made honest by naming it. In the late 20th century, the language changes, but the instinct does not. When an institution can no longer credibly deny that enslaved labor built its symbols, it shifts to a safer posture: acknowledgement without reconstruction, admission without specificity, commemoration without recovery. This is the modern form of silence. It is not the silence of denial. It is the silence of containment. You can hear it in the documents that do not speak like history at all, Documents written by engineers, preservation staff, facilities managers, compliance officers. They do not write about morality. They write about risk. They write about liability. They write about what is appropriate to disturb. And the most revealing phrase in that genre is always some variation of the same instruction. Do not excavate unless necessary. In a normal building, that is simply sensible. In a building raised by coerced labor and surrounded by centuries of administrative erasure, do not disturb becomes something heavier. It becomes a continuation of the same policy, translated into contemporary professionalism. Because the ground beneath a historic structure is not neutral ground. It is where earlier generations put what they did not want discussed. Not always remains. Not always artifacts. Sometimes it is simply the evidence of how the work was done, how many were there, how they were housed, what was built quickly and cheaply to sustain the schedule. Even when nothing dramatic lies under the soil, the directive still matters. Do not disturb is how institutions protect their preferred story from being complicated by physical proof. This is why the modern record can feel like an extension of the early record. The early paperwork paid enslavers and blurred the enslaved into categories. The modern paperwork manages risk and discourages digging into anything that might produce a headline. The vocabulary is different, the purpose is familiar. By the time the Capitol is completed in 1826, the public story has already begun consolidating into a narrative that centers architects, lawmakers, and ideals. The building's biography becomes a sequence of achievements. Design competition in 1793, usable chambers by 1800, destruction in 1814, rebuilding from 1815 onward, completion in 1826. These are the dates that frame the monument as national progress. But there is another set of dates that does not fit the clean arc. The years in which people were hired out as property to work on federal projects and recorded as Negro hire rather than recorded as workers with full lives. The years in which the government, on paper, treated bondage as a procurement solution. Those two timelines exist in the same place. One is celebrated, the other is filed. And filed things can be misplaced, lost, summarized into nothing, or left so fragmented that later generations can claim they simply do not know. This is what it means to say the archive was shaped, not merely incomplete. In 2012, something happens that would have been unthinkable in the 1790s and still politically uncomfortable in much of the 20th century. A commemorative marker is placed at the U.S. Capitol, acknowledging that enslaved African Americans helped build the Capitol and other federal buildings. That marker is an admission, a public-facing one, not whispered, not coded, not hidden behind euphemism. It says, in effect, the symbol was built with unfree hands. And it matters because it breaks a long habit of national storytelling. But the marker also exposes the scale of what has been lost, or what was never preserved in the first place. Acknowledgement is not the same as identification. It does not restore the names that were reduced to categories. It does not reconstruct the people whose lives were treated as interchangeable inputs. It does not reverse the record-keeping choices that made the ledger strong on payment and weak on personhood. A marker can honor the unnamed. It cannot unerase them. To understand why, return to the logic of the original paperwork. The government's relationship was with the enslaver. That relationship required detail. Names, amounts, dates. The government's relationship to the enslaved laborer was mediated through ownership. That relationship did not require the laborer's full identity to be legible. It required only that a body appeared and work was done. So, the institutional record becomes a mirror of institutional values. It preserves what the institution considered actionable. It discards, or never collects, what the institution did not consider worth the trouble. This is why modern historians can prove the system existed while still struggling to reconstruct its human detail. The proof is in the financial trail. The lives are in the gaps. And those gaps are not neutral. They are the outcome of the early republic's decisions about whose individuality mattered. When the institution finally admits the enslaved were there, it is not revealing a brand new fact. It is conceding a fact that was always available to anyone willing to read the receipts without flinching. The moral question is not whether this history is complex. Complexity is often used as a polite way to ask for silence. The moral question is whether we are willing to accept that a democracy's most famous buildings were made possible by a system that treated human beings as rentable tools. and that the record was organized to make that fact survivable without becoming scandalous. Because scandal requires visibility, and visibility requires names. That is why the oldest form of violence in these records is not the lash described in a sensational anecdote. It is the reduction of a person to a label. Negro hire is not simply racist language. It is an administrative technology. It is a way to keep human beings present without allowing them to become fully visible in the nation's memory. So when modern commemoration arrives, it is forced to operate inside the limits imposed by that technology. It can honor the category, but it cannot reliably restore the individual because the bureaucracy never treated the individual as the point, and yet the ethical demand remains. If the nation benefited from coerced labor to build its symbols, then the nation owes more than a stone marker. It owes the hard work of reconstruction, of pulling names from scattered records, of refusing euphemisms, of treating absence as evidence of intent rather than evidence of innocence. It owes the truth in the plainest possible language. The Capitol is not only the house where laws are made, it is also a record of how law and bondage coexisted, not as an accident, but as an arrangement. Now return to that opening moment, the work crew, the halted excavation, the careful instruction to keep the discovery from becoming a story. The details of any single incident can always be disputed. That is the institution's advantage. It can always ask for more proof than the archive was designed to provide. It can always point to missing pages as if missing pages are a natural weather event. It can always say the record is incomplete as if it had nothing to do with why it is incomplete. But a pattern does not require a perfect document. A pattern requires repetition. In the 1790s, the pattern is the leasing of enslaved labor and the reduction of people to categories in the payment record. In 1800, the pattern is invisibility under functionality. Once the chambers are in use, the labor becomes background. In 1814, the pattern is narrative cleansing through catastrophe. Fire becomes the central drama, and internal contradictions fade into the margins. From 1815 to 1826, the pattern continues through rebuilding and completion, with the national story focusing upward on permanence. In the centuries that follow, the pattern is the management of memory, omission, euphemism, fragmentation, delayed acknowledgement. In 2012, the marker breaks part of that pattern, but it does not break the whole machine. The machine persists anywhere a person's identity can still be treated as optional, anywhere the institution can say they helped without saying who they were. So here is what we can say without speculation, and what we cannot say only because earlier generations chose not to record it. We can say enslaved labor was used in building the Capitol because the financial documents preserve that reality. We can say the system worked by paying enslavers, not workers, because the receipts were designed to do exactly that. We can say the records often reduced enslaved workers to labels, because that reduction appears in the language itself. We can say the Capitol's public story long avoided these facts because acknowledgement did not become visible on a marker until 2012. And we cannot say every name because the system did not consider names necessary. We cannot reconstruct every life because the institution engineered the archive to preserve payments rather than people. That is not a natural limitation of history. It is a moral decision made legible through documentation. The responsibility now is not to treat those limitations as an excuse to stop. The responsibility is to treat them as an indictment of how the nation built its memory, who it chose to include, who it chose to blur, and who it chose to leave behind the symbol unnamed while the symbol demanded reverence. A republic is not only defined by the laws written inside its buildings, it is defined by what it was willing to do to raise the buildings in the first place, and by what it was willing to forget afterward. The Capitol still stands. The dome still declares permanence. The chambers still perform the rituals of governance, but the honest story of that place is not only architectural, it is documentary. And the documents, cold, careful, and incomplete by design, leave us with a simple obligation. Do not let a category replace a person. Do not let a monument outshine the names it consumed. Do not treat erasure as an accident when the paperwork shows it was an operating system. Remembering is not passive. Remembering is an act. And in this case, it is an act of refusal. Refusal to inherit the silence as if it were tradition, and refusal to call a polished story history when the receipts prove otherwise. There is a final convenience the archive offers the institution, and it is the most dangerous one, the ability to turn uncertainty into innocence. When the record is incomplete, the institution does not say, "We chose not to keep it." It says, "We cannot know." And "we cannot know" becomes a shelter, an ethical shelter, beneath which the most uncomfortable questions are allowed to die quietly. This is why modern technical language matters, not because it is dramatic, because it is effective. In earlier centuries, the machinery of silence relied on euphemism and omission. In the modern era, it relies on procedure, on recommendations, protocols, and risk assessments that sound neutral while producing the same outcome. The evidence stays buried, the names stay scattered, and the symbol remains protected from the kind of public reckoning that physical proof can force. You do not have to destroy a record to neutralize it, you only have to keep it from being examined. In the 1790s, the capital's labor system was documented in the way a procurement system documents inputs. Payment records exist, vouchers exist, ledgers exist. They prove the work occurred and that enslaved laborers were hired out and paid for as property. They do not reliably preserve the human detail that would require mourning, accountability, and repair. In the 1800s, as the building becomes functional, the workforce becomes background in the public story. In 1814, fire provides a rupture that makes selective memory easier. In the 1820s, completion provides closure. These are the historical mechanisms, but the modern mechanism is simpler. Do not disturb. On paper, it reads like prudence. Do not excavate without cause. Do not disrupt a historic site. Do not interfere with structural integrity. Do not create unnecessary risk. These are reasonable principles in isolation. In practice, at a site built by coerced labor, where the record itself was engineered to reduce certain people to categories, those principles become a second burial. They ensure that whatever the ground might still hold, whether artifacts, foundations, refuse pits, temporary quarters, or human remains, will remain safely silent. The question is not whether modern professionals are covering up in a melodramatic sense. That is a distraction. The question is whether modern professionalism can become the latest language of the same old impulse. Protect the symbol from the complications of truth. Because if the ground produces proof, the institution loses control of the story. Paper is manageable. Paper can be summarized. Paper can be framed as incomplete. Physical evidence is not as polite. Physical evidence forces specifics. And specifics are what erasure was designed to prevent. That is why you see the same posture repeated across time, even as the vocabulary changes. In the early republic, a worker's suffering is managed by replacement and euphemism. In later generations, a worker's memory is managed by omission and myth. In modern institutional practice, the discomfort is managed by procedure, identify sensitive areas, restrict access, recommend against disturbance, and record the risk in a technical report that no ordinary citizen will ever read. A technical report can be a tombstone without names. It can say, in professional language, what earlier officials said in crude shorthand. This matter is best handled quietly. And if you think that sounds harsh, consider what it produces. It produces a public landscape where the symbol is stable and the human cost remains abstract. It produces a history where institutions can admit, in general terms, that enslaved labor was used, while still avoiding the deeper questions that physical investigation might answer. Where were people housed? Where were they buried? What conditions did they endure? How many did not return? And what exactly was done to keep those facts from disrupting the narrative? The modern institution often claims it cannot answer those questions because documentation is scarce. That is true, and it is not an excuse. It is evidence of intent. Documentation is scarce because the documentation was never intended to preserve a full human story. It was intended to preserve financial transactions and protect schedules. Scarcity is not a natural phenomenon here, it is a policy outcome. That is why the most honest reading of the modern posture is not, "we don't know." It is, we are living inside the consequences of what was not recorded and what was deliberately minimized. If you accept "we don't know" as morally neutral, you accept the institution's preferred outcome, uncertainty without accountability. But uncertainty can be an accusation when the uncertainty has a cause. The cause was the early republic's decision to treat enslaved workers as rented inputs. That decision structured the paperwork. The paperwork structured the archive. The archive structured what later generations could claim about their symbols. And modern procedure now structures what can be physically discovered without controversy. This is continuity. Not a conspiracy meeting, not a single villain, but a stable pattern. Whenever the truth threatens the symbol, The system finds a way to keep the truth from becoming public knowledge. Sometimes it does this by erasing names, sometimes by burning records, sometimes by turning carved marks inward, sometimes by filing uncomfortable pages in private collections, and sometimes, in the modern era, by writing a recommendation that sounds like prudence and functions like suppression. If you want to understand why this matters, consider what the institution gains from leaving the ground undisturbed. It gains control over narrative. It gains the ability to offer carefully measured admissions, like a marker in 2012, while avoiding discoveries that would demand further action, exhumation, identification efforts, reburial ceremonies, public acknowledgement of casualties, and a reckoning that would be more than symbolic. Symbols are cheap compared to responsibility. A marker can be unveiled with speeches and applause. A full accounting would require sustained work, sustained attention, and sustained discomfort. It would require admitting not only that enslaved labor built the Capitol, but that the institution's silence about that labor was not merely forgetfulness, it was maintenance, maintenance of pride, maintenance of myth, maintenance of legitimacy. And because legitimacy is the oxygen of a political institution, anything that threatens it is treated as contamination. So modern professionals are asked to preserve the building. In doing so, they often preserve more than stone. They preserve the silence built into the site's history. They preserve the limits the archive imposes. They preserve the institution's ability to say, "We honor them," without being forced to say, "Here is what happened to them." There is a temptation to treat this as a purely historical matter, a lesson about the past. But the mechanism is still alive. It is alive wherever institutions manage uncomfortable truths with technical language and call the result neutrality. Neutrality is not the absence of values. Neutrality is the choice to protect existing power arrangements from being disrupted by new facts. And in this story, the existing power arrangement is the one that allowed the Capitol to be built by enslaved people and then praised for centuries as a monument to liberty without forcing the nation to look directly at the contradiction under its own feet. So, here is the ethical line the documents demand we draw. If the record is incomplete because someone chose not to record, then the incompleteness is not a limitation of our curiosity, it is evidence of their priorities. If the ground is undisturbed because disturbing it would be politically complicated, then the undisturbed ground is not merely preservation. It is a decision about whose dignity can remain postponed. And if a nation claims to be governed by the people, then it cannot accept a version of its most important building's history that treats the builders as an unnamed category and treats the gaps as an excuse for comfort. The question is not whether we can know everything. The question is whether we will treat what we do know as sufficient to demand honesty, because the archive, even in its engineered incompleteness, is still saying something clear. It is saying, they were here. It is saying, they were used. It is saying, the system that used them did not want to remember them as fully human. And it is saying, the easiest way to keep that system's reputation intact is to keep the deepest evidence out of sight. You do not have to accept that ease as destiny. You can refuse to inherit the silence as if it were tradition. You can treat the gaps not as a dead end, but as a moral fingerprint. And you can insist, without melodrama, without ornament, that when a democracy's symbols were raised by people denied democracy, the minimum obligation is not to honor them in general terms. The minimum obligation is to stop letting procedure do the work that erasure used to do openly, to stop burying the truth under professional language, to stop calling missing names history when missing names were the product of policy, 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 were the product of policy,